Hey, I'm Joel Wanasek. I'm a pro mixer and the co-founder of nailthemix.com. And today I want to rant it out and do another rant zone about a kind of a cool topic, which is why I bought a dumb console, right? A dumb console, meaning no automation, no moving parts in 2023. What? Hear me out. So recently I bought an SSL Origin 32 console, which is a 32 channel board. I've got it here in front of me. It's 32 channels of long faders and it's got 32 small faders on it, effectively making it a 64 channel inline console. And this console has EQ on every channel. It's got 8 buses for routing and things like that. But it has something on it that throws pretty much everybody who's ever looked at this. I mean, I literally get this question every time I post it on Instagram. It has no automation. How the hell can you be a pro mixer and work without automation? Like, what? Absolute freaking madness. And the answer is, it's actually simpler than you think. For those of you unfamiliar, let me bring back a little bit of a story here for you so you can see where we are today and why we made the decision. And then once we get through that, we'll talk about how I get around some of these hurdles and some of the advantages. So I've mixed over 20 years here professionally, and I've spent about 10 years in a hybrid system mixing with hardware and 10 years exclusively in the box. And I did so in kind of like pockets, meaning I was in the box for a while, then I was hybrid for a while, then I was back in the box, hybrid, etc. And 2 years ago, I went full analog and I bought my first dumb console. By dumb console, it means no automation, okay? Instead of a smart console. How cliche and trendy, right? Smartphone, dumb phone. Smart console, dumb console. So there's been a trend in audio recently to make dumb consoles without automation. Whoa, that's kind of crazy. Why would you do that? How can you possibly work without having automation? Well, okay, back it up. For a couple of years, I went back in the box for about 5 years. This is in like the mid, like 2016-ish or something like that. I went fully in the box. I sold all my gear because, I own a plugin company and I'm like, plugin technology is going to catch up. We don't need all those old analog tools. I feel like I can kick ass in the box and get a great mix. And then something happened to me 2 years ago. And if you've watched any of my rant videos and if you followed any of my mixes here on this channel, you'll notice I made a bit of a transition because I was doing my own band and I kind of decided to get back into being a professional mixer because I was doing a lot of corporate work for URM and Drumforge and stuff like that. And I also had another company that was in an unrelated industry to audio that did very well for some time. And I got out of that company and I came back and I was like, what do I love doing the most? And I realized I needed music in my life. So I picked up my guitar and I started playing music and I started a band. And just for fun. And I was doing my own mix and I did this really badass in the box mix. And I'm like, this is great. And then I went back to reference against some of the greatest metal mixes of all time. And I was like, man, something's missing. So I went down like a 2-month journey of just trying everything in the box to find that thing that was missing, like that sense of depth. And then I remembered, I'm like, oh, well, I really don't want a big hardware setup because it's a pain in the ass and it costs a lot of money. So let me get a summing mixer in here. I used to like a summing mixer a lot. So I bought a summing mixer and immediately on the first hit of the first drum, I heard what I was missing. I was like, oh, that's that sound I'm hearing on these classic records that I'm missing that are, it's referencing like Stabbing the Drama and As the Lay Die and Cauterize. And these are all mixes that I've broken down. Some of the best metal mixes like Andy Sneap stuff, Kill Switch and Trivium and things like that. I'm listening to these mixes. I'm like, something's missing. And I got the summing mixer in here and I immediately heard it. So then I'm like, okay, well, let me just get a bus compressor and I can just do everything else in the computer. That'll give me a little bit more of that depth and movement and just like that thing that analog does. And what ended up happening is I got that in here and I was like, oh, well, this is better. And then I was like, oh, maybe I get a couple of EQs or something, like a master EQ. And then, that led to about 4 or 5 months more of testing. And then suddenly I decided to buy an API box too. If you're not familiar with it, let me just break it down real quick. It's got 16 channels of summing on it and it's got 8 channels of input. So you can do 24 channels of mix down. It's got some EQ. When I started tracking, I don't really track, I'm just a mixer, but I did some guitar tracking and stuff through the console. I was like, oh my God, this sounds incredible. And then I started mixing through it. I'm like, this destroys my summing mixers. And I just fell in love with having that as a centerpiece of my studio because there's a lot of things on a board that I never realized because I never owned one, right? I've been mixing through a DAW in a computer my whole career. That just came to life. There was a certain depth, a front to back, a left to right, a width the way things sat in the instrument, like where it's, if I raise a fader digitally, I'm immediately like, oh, the sound needs to be fixed. I need to EQ, I need to EQ this. But then I would take those stems and I put them onto the console. And what would happen is I would raise the fader and then I raise the next fader against it and be like, wow, that stuff just kind of like locks and gels and I haven't touched an EQ. And I'm like, okay, I must be going crazy. So I'd print it, then I'd go back into the DAW and I'm like, nope, I immediately hear conflict. So what I learned is that there's certain characteristics that distortion and saturation and all of those electronics adds to music that gives it a front to back, that allows it to sit in a space where things are more separated, but they're more gelled. I know that doesn't make any sense, but if you've ever mixed on a board and spent some time on one, and you've been mixing long enough to understand what you're actually hearing, that's another thing. It takes some years to really understand this stuff, because like 10 years ago, when I started mixing hybrid, or a little bit longer than that, but approximately like a decade to a decade and a quarter ago, when I started getting gear and got into that, I didn't really know fully what I was doing or listening for yet, because my ear hadn't matured. But now I look back and I totally understand like the sound that something implies and like the depth that it adds. So a console actually makes things sound like they fit together in space more. They have this thing that comes out of the speakers, this width, this immediacy and urgency, but it also makes them gel more. So they're more separated, but they're more gelled. It's crazy. It's like you have the space that exists between sounds. And I talked about this in my How to Listen rant. So it's kind of like crazy how that works. So after working about a year on the API, I was like, this thing is really, really amazing. And then I went to NAMM this year and I spent some time looking at the SSL Origin, because I was thinking like, I want a 948, right? In AWS, it's got the automation, the stereo faders. That's a really incredible console. I definitely would have to save up some money from some time, but I definitely have the workflow as a mixer now to support that sort of thing. So I was like, it makes sense. So I was working on it. I didn't think much of the Origin, because the Origin was kind of just like again, it's a dumb console. It didn't have the recall and the automation. And I'm like, didn't think anything of it. So I got to NAMM, and this is where this kind of gets interesting. TLA pulls me aside. I'm talking to him, and he was like, hey, I'm talking about the console, and I'm like, I got this API and it's really amazing. I love how it sounds. I'm like, I want something bigger. I'm thinking of AWS. And he's like, dude, get an Origin. I'm like, what do you mean? It doesn't have recall. It doesn't have this. And, and like I start spouting off all the talking points I'd see people say on Gearspace. And he was just like, dude, I have an Origin and it sounds incredible. It sounds just like my 4000. It's a 4000. And I'm like, oh man, I love the sound of the 4000. Every time I've ever mixed on one, I've always been like, like that's my favorite board. But getting an old 4000 in here is just unattainable. I don't have room for a machine room. I don't want to pay $1,200 or $1,500 a month or whatever in power. You know what I mean? Like, I don't want to pay 20 grand a year to tech it. You know what I mean? Like, I just don't want to deal with it. Even though you can go buy like a 40 channel SSL 4000 from the early 90s for like, I've seen them going on Reverb for like $35,000, $40,000, which if you get a loan, it's actually not terrible. If you're a working professional, you can afford it, most likely. I kind of was taken back by that a little bit. And he went on for like 45 minutes about how badass the Origin was. I'm like, well, how do you deal with recall? How do you do this? How do you do that? It doesn't have any of that stuff. It's like my API. It's like I don't want to use it as just a summing mixer. I want to mix with my hands and, grab a fader, and like click around and, move faders and, do the thing. So, and he's just like, you can do all that. So then I got at this thing in my head. We're like, okay, let's just imagine that workflow would work. How would I make it work? So I had to kind of rethink my workflow about how to do it. And I have a good buddy, Rick Carson, who is a super badass, shout out, who was also hanging out with me at NAMM. And he was talking about how he recalls his console. And he's like, what I do is I take my channel strips on my board, so say channel 1, and I throw it in my DAW as an insert. So line in through direct out. And then I can just mix the song. And then when I'm done, I can print it. And if I need to re-automate something or whatever, I can do it. So you can EQ, you can balance faders, you can just mix, and you just print it in a pass. And now it's all committed and you just finish it up in your DAW. And then he inserts the master for the bus compressor and stuff. Again, master in through the out on his DAW thing. It's like a hardware insert. So he inserts the channels, right? So let's just say he's got 32 channels. I don't know how many he's got, but he inserts all 32 channels on, condenses his mix down to 32 tracks as inserts. And then he takes the master and puts it as an insert and then just prints everything. And then he gets, all of the tone of the console and the ease of digital. I'm like, that's a pretty cool workflow. So then another thing I was thinking about, which Tom kind of does, TLA, he was like, you can just basically mix the song and then just push the 0 dB button and bring everything back at Unity and turn off all the EQs and stuff if you got to do a recall, and then just finish it up. And then, you just keep all your routing intact, and that's the only thing you got to recall. So then I was like, okay, that's pretty smart. And then I started thinking, and then I kind of came up with my own clever way to do it. And I'm like, well, the console has 32 large faders. and it has 32 small faders. I could put the 32 small faders at unity, meaning the 0 dB button. I could pan them the same to mirror the large faders. And I could mix the whole song on the large faders because, again, I'm always going to keep my bass on, say, channel 1, 2, or my kick drums, or, I lay out my board the same way every time, no matter what I'm mixing. If I'm mixing hip hop or death metal, it doesn't matter. Like, I've got the board laid out. Like, my kick drum and stuff are coming through a certain channel, and my overheads, if I have them, or my cymbals or whatever, and my synths, all that stuff gets broken out. My vocals always hitting the same channel. So the way I devised to do this is I can route all of my stuff to the buses that I want to use, right? Leave that fixed. And then I can basically mix the whole song with my hands. And if I need to write automation, I can just print the direct out, you know what I mean? And print the stems. So when I'm done with the mix, I print the stems. If I need to automate something, I can do it with my finger, or I can do it in the computer, right? Post compression. I can do it with my finger on the board, or pre-compression, whatever. I can do it in the DAW. And then I can print those stems, and I can, again, further automate more if I need it. But then I can bring them back at Unity on my small faders and keep the same routing by simply pushing a single button per channel. So it takes me 30 seconds and bring that whole mix back. So I could be mixing a completely different song with all the EQs and stuff, everything, all my sends, etc., going to my large faders, but then I can recall it on my small faders at 0 dB and recreate the mix. And I could be mixing 2 songs, 10 songs at once, full analog with no recall. Then I got the board in here and I tested it and it worked. So, I haven't decided on which one of those workflows that I'm going to use, but for those of you that are like, well, how do you get around the automation? And there's no way, blah, blah, blah. I will tell you that there are different ways to do it. You just got to get a little bit more creative, and it involves you adopting a slightly different workflow. So when I did that and I came back with it, I got the mix to sound 99.9999998% of the original mix. And I'm talking like, because I have different converters. I can hear a little bit of different converter coloration in the mix, which is just like, if you can hear that stuff, you're a total nerd. No one is ever going to notice that or whatever. It's just so minute. We're talking about 0.00, like 0.01% change. It's like very, very subtle because you have different converters. But basically, that is ways that you can use a dumb console. Now, one thing that's interesting about working on a tool like this, having had it in here and mixing on it for, I've had it about a week. It's been installed for a week and I just started mixing. Got a couple of days experience in the real world, ripping through a bunch of different mixes in different genres. I will say that the advantage of working on a console is like when you're in the computer in the DAW, you've got to do so much work. And so many plugins, you've seen some of these complicated sessions on like Nail the Mix where people have like 10 plugins on every channel that just get something to sound good, 50 points of EQ, it gets crazy. On a board, it comes together so much faster. Like you can do so much damage with just the board EQ, a little bit of fader move, maybe a tap, a compression, the way everything sits in the space, the size, the width, the depth, the punch, the impact, the tone it adds to the mixes. I mean, it just sounds light years better. I'm hearing movement in the instruments like I've never heard in my work in my entire life. Like I can feel the bass player playing on the notes. I don't feel the need to limit stuff as much to get it to punch through. I don't need to EQ stuff. It just has a way of spreading stuff out. So, sonically, a tool like this is so superior that honestly, it's one of those things you don't fully understand. Like, it's going to be badass. And until you actually get it, you're like, I underestimated how much this is going to impact my work and how much of a level jump it's going to bring it up because it's easy to not understand it. So that was a major thing that I discovered buying a console. Now, the next question is, well, the consoles are so expensive, I can't afford one. So there's a couple things to think about this because for me, and everybody's situation is different, I understand. When you're a working pro, right, you're going to have clientele, you know what I mean? And if you're a decent and you're good at this and you've been around for a while, and again, I've been doing this over 20 years, so I have a lot of people that hire me and I've worked with many artists for many different years. And you're going to command a decent rate for a mix or a production, right? So I'm at the point where if I mix one song in a month, right, or master an album, I've paid for my console for the whole month. If I do another one, I've paid for my rent for the whole month. So all I got to do is mix 2 songs. After that, everything else is now paying other things. So I was able to take what I've got, right? My setup, my API rig, and a bunch of my outboard. I was able to sell it all, flip it on Reverb and stuff like that. And I was able to get the Origin in here for pretty much the same amount of money that I was already paying for the last year on my API and the other gear that I had purchased, maybe adding like an extra $150 a month. So all in all, when I did the math, and I bought one used, by the way, that's like 2 years old and it's in mint condition and it sounds great. It's flawless. I will say that I got a great price on it. It was a no-brainer. And basically, I was able to go kind of like you take out a car loan. I was able to take a 4.5-year loan where I had like a 3.5-year one on my API. And the API is much cheaper than the Origin. But when I did the math and I sold and flipped the gear and stuff like that, and all in all, and I calculated it all out, I realized that I could have gotten a much bigger console and a much better tool in here for like an extra $150 a month. So for me, it's like, I'd rather have a tool like that inspires me to work every day, that I can throw audio into and just love it and just have so much fun mixing with my hands as opposed to a mouse, and just have things come together, and just be more competitive in my sonics. And it's not going to cost me really any more money than I'm already paying and I've already been sustaining. So why not do it? To me, it was a no-brainer. And, I had to ask myself, like, if I wanted full automation on a board, right? Like going to an AWS 948. I wanted full automation. It would have cost, I think, at retail price, another like $60,000, I want to say, to go from Origin to an AWS. So for me, it's like, I wanted the Origin because it had the sound of the 4000. I wanted the AWS because it's super analog. It's a slightly different sound. It's a more modern SSL. But I have had an SSL summing mixer and some stuff. So I know that sound. And I wanted more of like the 4000 sound because I mix a lot of rock. And I had to ask myself, is the $60,000, which is, again, that doubles your monthly payment, on your loan, is that worth it? And to me, the answer was no, because I realized when I really thought about the workflow, I don't need a console with all that fancy crap on it. You know what I mean? I mean, honestly, like, you can just set it up for one mix. Sometimes you can recall another mix into the same setup. And it's just like, okay, I have a really scooped EQ. Well, I can throw a synth on here. Okay, now it sounds awesome. You know what I mean? Like, you don't even have to mess around. So I don't even write my settings down. I just mix the song. I take a picture of the master, which never changes other than maybe the master output level. I've got everything else set at Unity. I print the stems through the mix. After I mix it, I automate whatever I need to do. I can bring it back if I need to recall it. The workflow is awesome. It's super fast. It's faster than mixing in a computer because you can mix with all of your hands and music comes together faster and has more depth, impact, space, meaning I don't need to put 50 plugins on every channel anymore. And it's just crazy. So to me, professionally speaking, this is like, I think, one of the coolest moves I've ever done. And I'm so glad that I do it. Every day I come to work just so pumped up. I mean, I love mixing to begin with, but to work on a board like this has been a dream of mine for over 20 years. To finally get one in here and to spend time on it and to be able to use it in my workflow and in my mixes and to have figured out some workflows that work. Man, I'm having fun. I'm having fun, and I feel like I'm about to do some of the best work of my life. So that, my friends, is why I bought a dumb console in 2023, which most people think is insane. I think it was the smartest thing I've actually ever invested in so far in my entire career in terms of equipment. You can buy mic pre's, you can buy outboard and stuff like this, but at some point when you start getting enough outboard, you're just like, I could sell all this crap and just buy a console and get a better sonic result because you get a lot of bang for your buck. And some of these modern consoles really, really offer, for example, if you're looking for something cheaper, SSL has the XL desk. You know what I mean? It's like you can get it unloaded with no 500 series. I think it's like $20,000. You might be like, oh my God, that's a lot of money. But if you take like a 4 or 5 year loan on that, all right, so in the US, even at interest rates of like 6%, I'd have to calculate, but you're probably looking at like $500 a month. And if you're a working pro, I'm assuming your mix rate or your production rate per song is more than $500 because a lot of people that do this for a living can afford a tool like that. It's just part of the gig. It's like if you want to, I don't know why you have this adversity towards gear here in music because it's like if you buy a McDonald's franchise, you know what I mean? Like seriously, you can't even set up a McDonald's without spending like $500,000 in equipment. So you need to buy fryers and microwaves and grills and, cash registers and booths and all this stuff. So why do we think in professional audio, we can go in with having zero tools and, it's really, really, really hard to be competitive when you're using like a budget interface and no professional tools. Again, it depends what level you want to compete at. Not everybody's trying to beat CLA, but when you want to be, at the top of the mix game, for example, as a mixer or the top of the mastering game or whatever, at a certain point, you probably need to invest in some serious tools. So for me, I like the results I get with the tool set that I've bought and invested in. To me, it makes a massive difference in the way that my work sounds, and it's led to a quantum leap in my quality. And more importantly, it's just damn fun to come to work every day and just work on a workflow like that. It's so different. This thing gives me a little bit of carpal tunnel, the mouse, my fingers get sore, and now I can just mix with my hands, and it's just so nice. I can stand up, I can walk around my room, I can turn knobs. my assistant can get on the board. We just have so much fun mixing, and it's been a total game changer. So my friends, that is why, like I said, in 2023, I decided to invest in a dumb console, and I would encourage you to maybe do so. Like I said, you could get like an API the box, which is a phenomenal console, or like a SSL XL desk, or a Loop Trotter's got a good one, or there's a lot of, or a Neve 8424. There's a lot of really good options that you can start off with for a reasonable monthly payment if you're willing to take the credit on it. And you might find, like I did, that it might be one of the best moves you've ever done in your career. So that's my 2 cents on this rant. Hopefully that's interesting for some of you that are interested in these types of tools, some of the thought processes, how to get around some of the problems. Of course, I've got lots of content here on mixing. If you want to follow me on TikTok or Instagram, it's at Joel Wanasek. Of course, if you want to learn how to mix and not just listen to me rant about it, you can head over to nailthemix.com. Let me know in the comments below if you got any particular topics you want me to talk about or rant out on here. I'm happy to do them. Thank you so much for watching this, and we'll see you next time.